This is the third part of today's introductory session in cognitive neuroscience in the spring semester 2021. Here we will talk about psychology and cognitive neuroscience, how they're related, and also some basic overview on cognitive neuroscience methods. So, first of all, I would like to ask the question, does cognitive psychology require neuroscience? And to give you an answer why cognitive psychology needs neuroscience, here's an example from schizophrenia research. So patients with schizophrenia have cognitive impairments such as they respond more slowly to stimuli compared to participants without schizophrenia. Now, it is unclear which cognitive process actually is impaired, because there's actually quite a lot of processes that happen between stimulus and response. So we would like to open this black box and understand better which process is impaired in people with schizophrenia so that they can be treated more efficiently. So imagine that the perception is taking longer. That, of course, would require different treatment than, for example, if the response selection is delayed in participants with schizophrenia. So how do we tell these things apart? Because any of these could be affected if we detect a later response. Well, we can use event-related potentials of the EEG. For example, the P3 component. You don't need to understand what the P3 is. We will talk about the P3 in more detail in the second session, which will be particularly on event-related potentials and electroencephalography. For now, it suffices for you to know that the P3 is related to the stimulus categorization, so a decision process. Now, if you compare how control subjects and schizophrenic patients respond to certain stimuli in this task, again, you don't really need to know what task this is. Some kind of task where patients with schizophrenia responded more slowly. You can see that the onset of the P3 is this positive wave here. Positive is always plotted downward in the EEG world. So they have the same timing. There's no difference between control subjects and schizophrenic patients. The LRP, however, the lateralized readiness potential that reflects response selection, does vary quite a bit. So you can see an onset difference of 30, maybe 40 milliseconds here, and also in the amplitude. So that means that the correct button is selected later in schizophrenic patients, because the button press preparation is reflected in the LRP. The decision process, which button to press, is reflected in the P3. So just by measuring these two EEG components, we can conclude that the response selection rather than any of the other processes here is involved. So this is a good example showing how neuroscientific methods can give you some more insight into behavioral finding so that you understand better which cognitive process is actually affected. Another question you could ask is, does neuroscience require cognitive psychology? So here it does make sense to look at the hardware-software analogy. So according to that analogy, the hardware is the brain and the software are cognitive functions. So for example, you can see that this processor, CPU, is related to the brain, and the software, some code that we wrote in MATLAB, for example, describes the behavior that is based on processes going on in the brain. Now, what would happen if we were to measure the hardware exactly. With some kind of method, we would get an exact idea of how this processing unit looks like. Just like we could maybe with an fMRI scanner get an idea of what's going on in each individual, maybe a cubic millimeter or so in this brain. Well, would we really understand the computer and what was going on, what it was processing? No, we would probably not. Because just by understanding the hardware doesn't mean we actually know what the hardware is doing under which circumstances. So we need to understand the software as well, the human behavior, to really get an idea of how mental processes are happening. So that's why neuroscience does also require cognitive psychology. And I want to give you 2 examples of where this is particularly helpful. So, for example, imagine you present these 2 stimuli to participants, and then you see a difference in the EEG signal that is as a response to these 2 stimuli. So here the angry face has a larger negativity than the happy face for this given time window here. So what does this more negative voltage indicate? Without having any conceptual understanding of these processes, without having a theory or model, it doesn't really make sense to just measure the neural signature, because it doesn't tell us anything about how things are processed. It could be that there's more emotional processing, maybe there's more attention towards the angry face, or maybe there's more inhibition. There's just some difference. So a behavioral test is necessary to interpret the neural data. And this is what cognitive psychology can provide. Another example are mirror neurons. So mirror neurons was a very hot topic 20 years ago when it was discovered that monkeys show a very similar firing patterns of certain neurons when they grasp food with the mouth and when they just observe someone grasping food with the mouth, such as an experimenter. And what was concluded from these data is we understand action because the motor representation of that action is activated in our brain. Well, that might be true, but it could also mean something entirely different, because what does the neural pattern really represent here? It is similar, but is it really understanding another person's action? Or is it maybe the anticipation of food that happens in both cases? Is it empathy? There's no behavioral evidence. And you need behavioral evidence to back this up and better understand what it is. Otherwise, you may have some conclusions that are not backed up sufficiently with behavioral data. So if we want to explain neural processes, we always need a conceptual framework. Okay, so now I hope you believe me that both cognitive psychology or psychology in general needs neuroscience and vice versa. Now let's have a look at neuroscientific methods that we can use to measure cognitive processes. So there's 3 ways to differentiate between neuroscientific methods. The first one is whether it is stimulation or recording. So stimulation method means that the method itself does something to the brain, it affects the brain, and then we measure the consequence of that method affecting the brain. So this could be a behavioral or a neural measure, but importantly, the method itself affects the brain. A recording method would be something that we use to measure some process in the brain, and then typically it's some kind of experimental manipulation that affects the processes in the brain, and then we, as I said, only take a neural measure to see how this experimental manipulation affected the brain processes. A A second way to distinguish between different neuroscientific methods is whether they are invasive or non-invasive. And that really goes back, boils down to the question, does skin need to be broken or not? So a non-invasive method, you're outside of the brain, outside of the tissue. And invasive method means you have to go into the brain, into the nervous system, sometimes even into a single neuron. Of course, non-invasive methods are always preferred if possible, but some things cannot be. For some things you just need invasive methods. And the last way to differentiate between different neuroscientific methods is the property that is used by the method, the brain property. So it can be the electrical activity, for example, action potentials or EEG. It can be the magnetic activity, which is always a result of electric activity. So whenever you have an electric current running, there's also a magnetic field and vice versa. So one goes they both go hand in hand with one another, but they do sometimes they do sometimes depict different aspects of cognitive processing, which is why it can be very useful, for example, to have complementary measures here. And then last but not least, we have hemodynamic properties of the brain, which means there's a variation in the blood oxygen level due to varying brain activity. This is, for example, fMRI. So here's an overview of the most important cognitive neuroscience methods. I don't want to go into too much detail here because you can just look up the details on the slides or pause the video, but just to explain you how you can read this. So for example, electroencephalography or EEG is a recording measure, meaning we do record some process in the brain with that method. It is non-invasive because we don't break skin, we just put them on the scalp. And EEG uses electrical properties of the brain. Then fMRI, for example, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is a recording method, and it's also non-invasive, but it uses the hemodynamic feature, so the blood oxygen level changes. Okay, so much about psychology and cognitive neuroscience and some basic overview of how to differentiate between different cognitive neuroscience methods. In the last part of today's session, we will talk about the basics of neural activity. So, for example, how an action potential comes about.